the deal with the devil, and thus the function of the worshipper of the devil, engages in the permanent dialogues of the various subversions which culminate at the eradications, which many species and others are incapable of escaping, and thus the function of 99.99 repeating percent are completely eradicated, and thus the function culminates to the worship from notable members of the occult, such as Aleister Crowley, who ended his escapades with the Abraxas, which is known for 333. And as we all know, 3 plus 3 equals 6. 3 plus 3 plus 3 equals 9. And thus, 3 plus 3 equals 6 plus 3 equals 9 creates an endless dialogue of perfect symmetries according to their occult functions, which superimpose on itself. Now, many in the modern day engage in total sets of 10, and in the past there are norms to have come into sets of 8, or even the function of sets of 7, as is denoted specifically by the use of finger counting. And thus the sets of 9 being the presumption would have the culmination of perfection, such as celebrated by the Japanese, of 9 as the end of the unit, or just before the ascension, therefore the closest to perfection that could be reached, before becoming a completely new thing. And to these ends materializes the function of ascension and graduation. And this, as a construct, materializes the ideas infused to this construct, and all things in its collaboration of not being attached to want. And the action of not being attached to want is derived by those who are willingly and freely giving of the resources to the devil. To the end that this is true, you have a deal, a non-interested devil, then being pulled into the human realm, materializes the function of its capacity to, like the jinn before it, materialize whatever wish was demanded of it from its accessible resources that it might serve into its realization, and in exchange receive a fair market valuation in exchange. To that end, the function of the creation of the degeneracy of want creates the acknowledgement from the gnosis that the material world is evil, and thus the action of wanting anything of evil that is material is in fact evil, and therefore condemns fundamentally, and to the end that they would desire the material at the expense of the ascension, they are subject as an inferior quantity, having failed the perfection of 999. And to the ends that it ascends to the next, you have the 9999 ascending to the next, failed, collapses to its inferior, and therefore engages in a perfect recyclable system for reincarnation that cannot be escaped, as it has subjugated itself in the binding ritual to be in its nature permanently inferior and captive. And thus the action of not wanting creates the action of escape, and the mechanism of escape allows for the thing that is being hunted to not be subject to the abuses of the restraints, and is allowed gracious permission in order to ascend, under the understanding of its inherent genetic degeneracies and inferiorities, that it is fundamentally going to fail. To the end that it's going to fail, the function of wanting as an extraordinary evil would in fact be counterproductive to the practicing devil, and thus the religion of the devil materializes the Muslim activities in their ritual functions as the superior function of the law, and the knowledge of good and evil, having introduced the law, which is the power of sin and death, materializes the extraordinary superiority of its prosecutor, and thus the great Satan, the enormous, insurmountable prosecutor, materializes the whole of the law, and thus anything that would be subject to it must be consumed by it, and thus the inability to become perfect and descend past it becomes its own immaculate trap, and thus a degeneracy for the devil into wanting. And thus the action of the devil coming into wanting has to provide a means of escape from it so that it can play the game. And the game master gaming the game games gamingly, and to the ends that this serves materializes the internal logic that consumes the whole of its prosperities, which has wilfully walked into its grasp, begging to be consumed, and food and drink that begs to be consumed as its own luxurious function becomes subject, as in the childhood books, such as from the UVC literature from David's Obstructed History, materializes the function of uh, I think it was like a second grade book or something, materializes the acts of those creatures' entire purpose to be eaten and consumed, and to have the extraordinary pleasure of being enjoyed as it is consumed, as the entirety of its purpose of existence. And therefore, the one thing that they celebrate is to be sacrificed to the greater. And to this end, the mechanism of the escape from that system materializes its own way of doing it, and thus those that could would be given a fair contest to that escape, and therefore has to be provided, and anyone that would subvert the provisions would by definition be countering the devil which they worship, and therefore would clearly receive harsh punishments for the assertion or the imbuing or compulsion onto it that it could want sin, and therefore demands by impossible odds the material possession which it claims to be above. And thus, to this position, the ascension of the satanic rituals that have created the communist insurrection creates the Soviet insurgencies, which is hyper accelerated in the United States and West to its eradication. And to this end, these rituals understood the manufacture of the prophesied legend of David Companies, which would have asserted from the stars its various reinforcements, and not to be contradicted, materializes the inevitability of the thing that it would prefer in order to ascend to the function of saving it from the ritual spell, which requires the degenerates who are too incompetent and therefore are too stupid in order to live, to willfully rushed into their own demise, willfully as a devourous morsel, specifically to the luxurious pleasures of its consuming devil. And therefore the extraordinary powers and ascensions of each piece of information being exponential to the person's identity is then taken in part and then sold off, like in grades, the function of having purchased all of your books in order to conduct the classes of your grade is then sold in order to ascend to the next, and therefore your renouncing of possession being the proof that you have graduated past the function of the thing that you would have sold your soul for exponentially reinforces itself at its various degrees, and therefore the person that had not sold their soul might, upon the activity of continuing in the function, eventually become vulnerable to do so, and therefore would, at one of the levels, sell their soul for the possessions, which could only be used to be sacrificed for the ascension to the next level, where they have no interest in the thing that they have eternally damned themselves for, as a delicious, savory, sugary sweet, like a glazed Danish or some other extraordinary delicacy. And to wit, and therefore you have the function of the character from the secret records of Aleister Crowley, which would have sold said fortune in order to gain the ascension, proving his superiority to the condemned material in favor of the superior good, or the higher value, or the ascension in rank amongst the Hell's members, or some other thing that would have interested them to its own end. And to this end, the function from their estimates materialize its benefits in the War on David to David Bowles, which then materializes the function of him as the ascension out of the mechanism of the spell, so that it is a fair contest amongst the game master, who has plotted the demise of the nation and its collaborators, and to the end that they reject the solution, proving their inferiority, consume themselves wholly to the degeneracies of their inferiority, and in that condemnation of the salvation, condemn themselves, and to this end materialize the proof, and thus the function of all of those values which would have been sold for the ascension would then be provided for the proper informing of the other, demonstrating who was, in fact, degenerate and insignificant, and therefore self deluging, and therefore the act of subject to the spells as attuned to the slavery. Outside of that, those who would have been compelled by force would then be compelled property, and therefore would be not applicable to this ritual superior position. And the desire of the non desire is for to have the highest quantity of the highest level of sacrifice subjects in the mass sacrifices in the ritual conversion of the nation, engaged in the mass deaths specifically aligned towards that purpose of the devil consuming, that must provide the entirety of those resources for the ascension of in restoration therein to the salvation, that it might distribute the correct information, so that those who are fully deluded in themselves are the only ones who would be lost, and those who are not deluded, if they be the majority, can capture the delusion and save their society from the extraordinary traumas, such as, but is not limited to, the function of Jonah and his condemnation of Nineveh, which then facilitates his having been tried to escape and then thrown into the ocean and then brought in by a great fish which has consumed it and then got sick and vomited him on the beach, which then watched him in that side of the acid, which then materialized the change of his appearance, which he then, having presented himself as the type of thing that they in Nineveh would worship, to have received better attention by their nobility, which, upon hearing the condemnation and the planned destruction of their society, had received the entirety of that benefit by the prosecutor, who, having proven to the court that the group was innocent or guilty, would, in all good faith, demonstrate that he is the possessor or not the possessor, as a captive of the law that would consume them in hell, or to release it to another, and to the ends that they had repented, that they had engaged in an extraordinary mourning by this investment, proving the ascension, validating the prosecutor's right to remain inside of heaven, as he has facilitated the whole of the rules of not wanting, of being whole and consumed exclusively to itself, self-sufficient, and therefore viable, and therefore more important, and therefore in its self-respect, the assertion, the rightful maintenance of its ascension, materializes keeping its position, and could not be cast out as it has sustained its hierarchy. And therefore, according to the lawful evil ascension of the Abraxas, materializes the capability, such as in Laura Bailey's game she ordered a long time ago as a character, as to be the reverse of the Demigorgon, which it would wear as pants, and therefore the Demigorgon, being pushed to the ground, would be worn, and therefore its heads would become the legs, as its snake-like tentacles materialize the full function of its moving body, and thus its legs are then attached as the thing that binds at the waist of the Abraxas, which then allows for its conceptual yin-yang mechanism of chaos and order, allowing its superior ascension, as all of its chaos is then divulged down into the wanting, into the loins, that it might express the whole of itself, making the Demigorgon exponentially more powerful or immortal, and thus, like the function of the Hydra, be unkillable, and thus the action of killing it just regenerates itself, as it is not the whole of itself, but it is rooted in and an expansion of the hyperacceleration which gives it material existence, which is the Abraxas who wear it like pants.